Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordy.
And I'm Brad.
And welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case and Brad here, and potentially you guys.
Don't know a damn thing about it.
So this week we are traveling back down under to Australia to tell you guys the story of one of the most bizarre serial killing duos you'll probably ever hear about. This case is more well known than most of the stories we cover, so you might have already heard it before, or you may just know of it. But even still, it's surprisingly not as talked about as you might think, and it's one of those cases that almost plays out like a movie because some of the details are just so outrageous, or it's one of those scenarios where it's like, if this wasn't a movie and I didn't know it was based off a true story, probably would believe it's too far-fetched to be real. But as they say, truth is stranger than fiction. Today we are talking about Australia's infamous Truro Murders. Now, during the late 1970s, the area of South Australia was plagued with a string of unexplained and bizarre disappearances of young women who all seemed to vanish without a trace. No sign of the girls would be found for over a year before the horrific details were discovered and the story of an unlikely pair of serial killers would flood the headlines of every paper all over the country. So let's just jump right into it. I don't really have much to add this week, so let's just get right into the case.
Sounds like it's going to be a good one.
It's going to be a crazy one.
I like crazy.
It's April 20th, 1978, and a man named William Thomas is out in the bushland along with his wife and brother, and they're just out there to go mushroom picking. They are mushrooming just off of Swamp Road outside the town of Truro, Australia, located about 24 miles from Adelaide. The area where they were was fairly isolated from civilization and a place you did not want to be caught without water or proper protection from the sun, which I think describes a good chunk of Australia. I've never been, but
The outback sounds terrifying to me.
very terrifying. I would not want to be caught out there, period.
I mean, I want to visit Australia, but it sounds overall dangerous.
It does, and that's nothing against Australians. I would love to visit
No,
one day.
I want to visit, but it's like jellyfish can kill you.
Spiders
Spiders can kill you. Snakes can kill you. There's great white sharks everywhere you look.
koalas. Now, as they spent the morning looking for mushrooms, they found nothing noteworthy until about midday. As he explored an area hidden by several large rocks, William spotted a large bone sticking up out of the ground. He immediately assumed it must be from a dead cow, and at first didn't give it much thought as he headed back towards his home. But back home, William kept thinking about the bone and thought how odd a cow would somehow end up all the way out there in the bushland like that. He casually mentioned it to his wife, who shared in his confusion and suggested they go back out the next day and check it out again. The next morning, the two set out looking for the bone, and after some searching, they found it. William's wife went over and pulled the bone out of the ground, expecting to see a hoof, but instead, she and William were even more confused to see a shoe at the end of the bone. Even this, though, didn't worry them, as at first they thought it was someone's idea of a joke, and they kind of just thought, who would stick a shoe on the end of a cow bone? But after popping the shoe off, both realized to their horror that this bone didn't belong to a cow, as at the end of the bone was a mummified human foot with its toenails painted. The two quickly rushed back home and called the police to investigate, and within hours, officers were out in the bushland where the human leg was found, and upon further investigation, they discovered the partially buried remains of a young woman, now completely skeletonized. Close by, they found several pieces of bloody clothes, jewelry, and bloodstains on nearby rocks.
There was blood stains still on nearby rocks, but this was a skeleton at this point.
Yes, so it was very obvious they had been there for a while. But
You would think that would wash off, or at least I would think that.
you would think, but who knows? It's the Outback. After taking the bones in for an autopsy, no sign of a cause of death could be determined, and through dental records, investigators were able to identify the body as belonging to an 18-year-old girl named Veronica Knight. Now, Veronica had disappeared on the evening of December 23rd, 1976, from the streets of Adelaide while doing last-minute Christmas shopping. No trace of her was ever found, and she seemed to have vanished without a trace, with authorities eventually believing that she chose to run away willingly, despite protests from her family that she would never do that. Even after her remains were found, though, authorities announced to her family and the public that they believed her death was an accident, although they couldn't figure out how or why Veronica would end up 40 miles outside of Adelaide in the middle of the desert with no signs of foul play. They concluded that she had gotten lost out there and eventually succumbed to dehydration or the elements.
Blood was all over the rocks. That seems to me like maybe some foul play was involved.
Me too. Of a
4-year-old blood all over the rocks. So that must have been pretty deep on them.
somehow, some way, they rationalized that this was an accident because they were like, the autopsy doesn't show any signs of like stab wounds or any signs of foul play. So the obvious, it must have been an accident. Screw how she got there or why there's shredded clothes or blood everywhere. They're just like, eh. So with that, Veronica's case was closed and filed away, and it was quickly forgotten about by the public. For almost a year, Veronica's case was fading from memory. That is until April 15th, 1979, when the remains of another young girl were discovered less than a mile away from the site where Veronica's remains were found. That day, 2 hikers passing through the area stumbled upon the partially buried remains of a skeleton and quickly called police. Investigators had little to go on in terms of evidence at the scene, and again, no obvious cause of death was found. But through dental records, they were able to identify the remains as belonging to a 16-year-old girl named Sylvia Pittman. Sylvia had disappeared off the streets of Adelaide on the evening of February 6, 1977, with no trace of what happened to her ever being found until now. Now, right away, the similarities between Veronica and Sylvia's case were noted by investigators who decided to reopen Veronica's. The fact both vanished under similar circumstances and were found buried in the same area led to the conclusion it was likely both were killed by the same person. Now, as they began to shift through other missing person cases in the area, the Adelaide press got a hold of the story and sent the public at large into a panic as news of a potential serial killer began to spread all around Adelaide. Several newspapers offered a $10,000 reward for any info leading to the killer, with police eventually offering a $30,000 reward. Looking back through recent missing person cases, investigators found 5 other similar cases of young women who disappeared under mysterious circumstances that they believed may be related to the other 2. In the days following the discovery of the 2 bodies, a massive search party was organized by police to comb over the bushlands outside of Truro. And after 11 days, they found something less than a mile from where the 2 bodies were found. 2 more skeletons were found partially buried. Dental records confirmed that they were the bodies belonging to 26-year-old Vicky Howe and 16-year-old Connie Lordanides. 2 of the missing women investigators believe may be linked to Veronica and Sylvia's case. With the discovery of 4 bodies now, the hunt was now on for a serial killer, as the public and police alike began to panic over just how many victims this unidentified killer might have, and worst of all, is he still active? But before we get into that and how this case ends, let's go back and figure out how we got here, and to do that, we need to talk about the killers behind these horrific murders: Christopher Worrell and James Miller. James William Miller was born on February 2nd, 1940, and was the youngest of 5 children, and from the very beginning, his life was a rough one. He was born into extreme poverty as the family struggled to put food on the table every day, and often there wasn't enough to go around for everyone, with James often being the odd one out, as he was described as being, quote, incredibly quiet and shy. By the time he learned to walk, James would constantly attempt to flee from his troubled home life, with police often finding him wandering along the side of the road at night and having to return him home. James refused to speak of his childhood after his capture, but he did state that it was a home filled with abuse, which is obvious in the fact that a 4-year-old was attempting to run away from home. And, it's like they say, feel bad for the kid doesn't excuse what he's going to do later on. But by the time he was 11, James was acting out and causing trouble in school, and his behavior got so bad that his teachers recommended that he be shipped off to a reform school, which is exactly what his parents did. James spent the rest of his schooling at the school, which turned out to not be much better than his home life, as the teachers would often beat students into submission. More kind of like a military camp than a school, and it was more so less on education and more on, we're going to beat some discipline into you just until you stop resisting and obey. By the time he turned 18, James left school with no real education, no family, and no real hopes for the future. He made little money here and there working under the table as a laborer all over Australia, but those jobs were quickly drying out. Desperate, James turned to stealing and robbery in order to survive, often breaking into cars and homes at night. By the time he was 20, he had been arrested 30 times for car theft, robbery, and breaking and entering. James would later say that each time he was released from prison, he would try to make an honest living and applied to several jobs, but found that none had any, quote, sympathy for a guy like me. This then led to him stealing and robbing to survive, and this cycle repeated for the whole entirety of James's life. And I will also say, so up to this point, it is hard not to feel sorry for James Miller. He never really did have a chance, and although he had an extensive criminal record, his crimes were never violent. He never hurt or robbed anyone, like an actual person. All the homes he robbed were wealthy, rich people, and his idea was like, I'm like Robin Hood. I'm robbing from the rich and giving to the poor.
Me being the poor.
Me being the poor. And, I'm not condoning stealing or robbery, but I'm just saying,
they weren't violent crimes.
They weren't violent crimes, and I get from the fact that he had a horrible upbringing, like no support system his entire life. And when you're homeless, hungry, cold, you got to do what you got to do. So up to this point, he is just, I think life dealt him a bad hand. But
also, he was arrested over 30 times, and nobody ever done anything.
No, and that's the thing I was about to say, too. This is also, remember, the 50s and 60s, so a lot less resources for homeless people back then, and it kind of just was, do what you got to do to live another day. So up to this point, I do have a bit of sympathy for James Miller. That completely goes away once you learn what he's about to do, but... So when he was sent to prison the last time for car theft in 1976, the cycle of James's life seemed to be repeating itself once again. But this time was different. By pure chance, he would share a cell with a man who would change his life forever. A 22-year-old named Christopher Worrell. James would later state that he first noticed Chris right away upon entering the prison and was drawn to the young man's, quote, bubbly aura, as he was very upbeat and cheery. Now, this was the complete opposite of James's demeanor, who was often described as being, quote, depressed and moody. Christopher was young, handsome, and described by guards and former friends as being very outgoing and energetic most of the time, and just a real charmer. But that charm had a dark side, as Christopher was in prison currently for the very violent sexual assault of a young woman, something he had been arrested for in the past on at least 2 other occasions. So that's something too. Do not let appearances are deceiving. If you just looked at him, you wouldn't think this man is a violent sexual predator, but he is. James quickly became infatuated with the younger man, and Chris seemed to welcome his new friend, and the two quickly hit it off and began spending all their time together. The two played cards, worked out in the courtyard, and talked about their past while back in their cell. Chris remained pretty tight-lipped about specific details from his past, but he told James that he was born on January 17th, 1954, and his father had died suddenly when he was still a child. His mother remarried to Chris's stepfather, who turned out to be abusive, causing Chris to run away when he turned 16. After that, he spent some time in the Air Force before leaving, and then spending all of his time traveling around Australia. Chris explained that the assault charges against him were bogus, and that it was all a misunderstanding, and all of it was consensual. James' letters state that Chris was so bubbly and kind that he believed him, as it just didn't seem plausible that someone as handsome and kind as Chris would ever have to assault someone to get what they wanted.
He probably didn't have to assault anyone to get what he wanted. That's what he liked.
Well, and sexual assault is not about sex, it's about power. So, common misconception that a lot of people still believe it. No, it's not true. So after just a few months together, the two had grown extremely close as friends. But for James, something more was developing here. All his life, from the time he was 11, James knew one thing about himself that he kept a secret from everyone. He was a homosexual. You always have to know this is a queer true crime podcast. We cover queer-related true crimes. So it is always funny because I'm like, when we start a case off that's not a conventional, seemingly queer case, it's always like, I know everyone's waiting for the foot to drop, where it's like, what is the queer aspect of this case? It's going to be like, that's why you guys are covering it. And here we are. So he first realized this while at the reform school and experimenting with the other boys. Afterwards, according to James, it was pretty obvious that he was a homosexual, even if he never said it. And this is another reason why he was never able to hold down a steady or real job, which, 50s, 60s Australia, or anywhere for that matter, if you're very feminine or flamboyant, or you just have that energy to you, I guess, they're not going to hire you, and it does suck. It's discrimination. Now, although he had experimented with men in the past, James had never felt love for another man. That is, until he met Chris. This crush soon turned into a full-blown infatuation on James's end, and he began to cling to Chris's every word and couldn't stand to be apart from him longer than a few minutes. Now, it's unclear how the conversation came up, but at some point, Chris became aware of James's homosexuality and his infatuation with him, and although Chris was straight, he didn't seem to mind James's feelings, and it didn't affect their friendship. Several inmates later interviewed believed that this was because Chris liked the fact that he had such a big and intimidating dude like James as essentially his bodyguard. Because although he was timid and quiet, James looked pretty intimidating. He was a big boy, standing over 6 feet tall, and he was just built like a brick house. Both men were set to serve around 4 years in prison, and they settled into a pretty good life, for prisoners. But a little over a year in, James was heartbroken to learn that he was actually granted parole and was getting released. I don't think I've known any other case I've heard where someone was actually heartbroken to be getting let out of prison. James was released into the custody of his sister and set up to get back on the right track with a real job. But this isn't what James wanted. He wanted to be with Chris, and he couldn't stand the thought of being away from him. So within 3 months of being on parole, James intentionally got himself rearrested by breaking into a convenience store and just stealing a bunch of random shit. And with that, he was placed back in prison and was once again reunited with Chris.
I mean, that was a big risk. They could have just not put him back in the same cell.
That too, and it's not always a guarantee you're going to get sent to the same prison or wherever. So it was a risk, but it's also a thing love makes people do crazy things. And this was definitely crazy. Now, once back in prison together, the two's relationship seemed to go a bit further. Chris would now allow James to perform sexual acts on him and give him oral sex while he looked at pornographic magazines, something James happily accepted. Chris often enjoyed looking at hardcore BDSM magazines when this was happening, depicting women in various stages of undressed, tied up, and gagged. The two developed a dom-sub relationship, with Chris now acting as James's master, ordering him around, telling him what to do, and when to give him oral sex, and this is something James also happily did and accepted. As the release dates drew near, both men talked about finding an apartment together once they were released. Although Chris told James he was straight and their sexual relationship would stop once they were both on the outside, something James accepted because he couldn't stand the idea of not being a part of Chris's life. 9 months after he was rearrested, James and Chris were both released on parole and kept true to their promise of getting an apartment together in Adelaide. Both got steady jobs working at a manufacturing company and spent their free time together hanging out and exploring the city. James would later recall that this was the happiest time of his life. The two spent their free time partying and bar hopping, and like he predicted, James stated Chris never had trouble attracting women and would often bring them home to have sex while he sulked in his room. Chris would also enjoy exploring the sex shops around Adelaide and often drag James along too, while they searched for the type of hardcore BDSM magazines Chris was interested in. Now, for a while, the two kept on the right path, actually. So, initially, they started on the right path. They kept out of trouble. They both had honest working jobs. They made honest money. But eventually, James started to notice cracks forming in Chris's cheery demeanor. Every so often, Chris would complain about severe headaches, and during these headaches, he would lash out and become enraged or angry at everyone around him. James did his best to control Chris during these episodes. They seemed to be getting worse as time went on. Eventually, the two started to slip back into their old habits as Chris came to James with a great idea. Since James was gay, he could find out where all the hottest gay bars are around town and the best cruising spots to go to. And once there, Chris could use his good looks to lure rich, wealthy men into their car and rob them of all their money. Although reluctant, James agreed to help Chris as he didn't want to risk losing him. And for several months, the two would drive around to the gay bars and cruising spots and pick up men with Chris offering them sex to get into the car. Once in the car, Chris and the man would fool around in the back seat in order to distract the man from realizing James was driving them to a secluded location. Once there, Chris would beat and rob them before kicking him out of the car. This went on for several months, and during this time, while he wasn't prowling for men to rob, Chris had James drive him around in order to prowl for women to sleep with. So also, they're like, also perfect victim because these men aren't going to go to the police.
They're not going to say anything because they're going to out themselves.
Then they would have to explain, what were you doing in a park at this hour getting to a car with a strange man? So it's one of those perfect scenarios where it's like, use our good looks, pick up these men, rob them, and the police aren't ever going to do anything. So when they weren't doing that, they were prowling for women, or Chris was having James drive him around like a chauffeur while he looked for women to pick up or catcall. Every day, when they weren't working, all Chris wanted to do was drive around the city looking for women to talk to. Most of the time, the women happily got in the car and had consensual sex with Chris. But during one incident, when a woman they picked up refused Chris's advances, he responded by flying into a blind rage and sexually assaulting her. Afterwards, James drove the woman home, apologizing for Chris and telling her, quote, "Don't worry, you'll get over it soon." Following this incident, Chris's mood began growing more frequent and violent, with him constantly complaining of headaches and wanting to be left alone. Now, James tried to suggest to him that he might actually have something wrong with his brain if his headaches are that severe, but Chris wouldn't hear it. All he wanted to do and think about was sex. Driving around the streets of Adelaide every evening looking for women to sleep with or assault became Chris's number one priority in life and the only thing he was focused on. But as time went on, he was finding himself bored with casual sex and wanted to start practicing his BDSM fantasies, and so he began to carry around rope in his car in order to tie the women up. But after a while, that was also growing boring for him, and he just kept wanting to push the envelope more and more in terms of his sexual fantasies. All this seemed to come to a head on December 23rd, 1976, when the pair's usual evening strolls through Adelaide ended in the murder of their first victim. The evening streets of Adelaide were crowded with thousands of people doing last-minute Christmas shopping, and after driving around the streets for a while, Chris mentioned to James that it was going to be difficult to find a girl amongst the crowd, and instead he would just get out of the car and look on foot while James circled the block a few times. And also, before I get too deep into all the details, it should also be noted that all this information is coming from James himself, which investigators believe most of it is pretty truthful, but again, take it with a grain of salt. After circling the block 3 times, James pulled back up and spotted Chris standing on the curb in the company of a young woman, 16-year-old Veronica Knight. James pulled over and the two climbed into the back seat, with Chris telling him to start driving towards the bushlands as he had promised to show Veronica the night sky over the mountains. Veronica mentioned that she had gotten separated from her friends in the crowd while Christmas shopping and was happy to find a ride home, making Chris promise to take her back to her home before her curfew. As they drove, Chris flirted with Veronica and she seemed to return his flirting, according to James. Chris instructed James to pull off a dirt road and park the car in a remote location, at which point he told James to go for a walk while he and Veronica had sex. As James did what he was told, he stated he last saw the two making out passionately. James walked along the mountains in the dark, thinking about nothing other than his jealousy over not being the one sleeping with Chris. James stayed gone for the car for about 40 minutes before making the walk back. Upon returning, he found Chris sitting alone in the front seat of the car, staring blankly ahead. When he asked where Veronica was, Chris told him, quote, "In the back, I killed her." At which point James looked in the back seat and saw Veronica lying on the floor dead with a rope tied tightly around her neck. When he tried to question Chris on what happened, he simply replied, "I just killed her. I don't know why," before threatening James that he would kill him too if he didn't drop it. Chris ordered James to start driving out to the bushland past the town of Truro, the entire car ride filled with silence as Chris refused to speak or allow James to speak. Before going to bed that night, Chris made James swear not to tell anyone about what just happened, and James agreed to keep quiet. And it should be noted, James was like, "I love Chris. I don't want to lose Chris, so I'm going to do whatever he tells me. Even if that means
being an accomplice to murder."
That's not love, folks. Over the following week of Christmas, James stated Chris had returned to his normal, cheery, and happy self, and he began being unusually kind and affectionate towards James, lavishing him with gifts, taking him out on dates, and treating him like he was the only person that mattered in the world, with James describing this as one of the happiest times in his entire life. This also is, of course, a very classic manipulation technique because, Chris was like, he did just see a murder. He could can me if he wanted to. I know he is obsessed with me, but I'm just going to dial it up for a while just to hammer that point home. But sadly, that happiness will be short-lived as 1976 turned to 1977, and right after the new year, Chris was back to his old ways of having James drive him around looking for a woman to pick up. On the evening of January 2nd, 1977, the two were driving the streets of Adelaide looking for a girl for Chris when he had James pull over and let him out. About 30 minutes later, Chris returned to the car in the company of a 15-year-old girl named Tanya Kinney. Chris instructed James to drive them back to the apartment and wait outside in the car while he and Tanya were inside having sex. Tanya had just arrived in Adelaide after hitchhiking from Victor Harbor, and according to James, she was chatty and upbeat the entire car ride and as she was led into the apartment by Chris. James stated he fell asleep waiting in the car for a little over an hour before he was awoken by Chris banging on the window and asking for his help. Chris led James inside to one of the bedrooms where the body of Tanya Kinney was lying lifeless on the floor. She was still fully clothed, but her hands and feet were bound together with zip ties, and she had, I'm not sure what this means, she had medical plaster poured over her mouth to keep her from screaming.
I think that's like what they make casts out of.
So what the stuff they had material to make casts over, he had over her mouth to keep her from screaming. She also had a serious head wound pouring blood. Chris again stated he didn't know why he killed her, and that it just happened. James became enraged and began yelling and fighting with Chris about his actions, but Chris dismissed his screams and told him that they would both go down if they did not get rid of the body.
Actually, I think a plaster in Australia is like a Band-Aid.
Okay, that might make more sense because it was like medical plaster. Why do they just have medical plaster?
Yeah, I think it's like they call Band-Aids plasters. I believe somebody can, let us know if that's true, but
Yes, one of our Australian listeners, please let us know, because that was kind of confusing when I read it, because I was like, that's horrific if it's actual, like, medical plaster they used to make casts out of, but it's also weird that they just have that lying around the apartment. But again, this is the 80s. People could buy chloroform just at the Dollar Tree. So the two waited for nightfall before loading Tanya's body into their car and driving out to the outskirts of Wingham, where they buried her in a shallow grave. The same cycle as before began to repeat itself. Chris returned to his normal cheery self for a few weeks, and then eventually he would begin complaining of headaches before growing angry and violent. Just 4 days after his 23rd birthday, Chris was ready to go look for another girl. On January 21st, 1977, he and James picked up 16-year-old Juliet Makita waiting at a bus stop in Adelaide. Juliet was leaving her part-time job at a local store and waiting for the bus to take her home to Port Wakefield when the two men pulled up and offered her a ride home, which she accepted. Instead of driving her home, Chris instructed James to drive out to the bushlands of Truro and park. James got out of the car to go for a walk while Chris, quote, had fun with his new girl. James didn't make it far, however, from the car before he came running back after hearing screaming. When he got back, Juliet was attempting to flee from the car before Chris tackled her to the ground and began to strangle her. According to James, he screamed at Chris to get off of her and even tried to pull him off, but he just wasn't strong enough, and Chris strangled her to death. Chris again threatened James to get off of him or he would be next.
Now, wasn't James a big man?
James was a big man, and so, again, those are the things where it's like, take it with a grain of salt. I'm going to tell you now, James doesn't technically kill anybody, and that becomes a huge point of contention for him and his lawyers. Like, he didn't actually lay hands on any of these people. Still an accomplice, a very big accomplice. You drove these women to their death.
Multiple women. So you knew what was going to happen when you drove them out into the middle of nowhere, even if you didn't actually kill them yourself.
And you technically, I think, still did kill them yourself, because they would not be in that situation where they could be murdered if you didn't drive them to their deaths, literally drove them to their deaths.
Or turned in this POS.
Or turn them in. But also, as we'll see, James was fiercely loyal to Chris. A straight man that he knew he couldn't have.
You always want what you can't have.
You do always want what you can't have. The two left Juliet's body to decompose out in the desert sun, and following the third murder, James stated that he told himself he wasn't going to try and stop Chris again, and was just going to let him do what he wanted to do, as he, quote, loved Chris more than anything, and only wanted him to do what made him happy. And it's like, he's not like some hobby you don't agree with. He's murdering women, and James is like, I love Chris. I just want him to be happy and do what makes him happy. And if that means murdering innocent girls, so be it. James also rationalized Chris's behavior, as he still firmly believed that something was medically wrong with Chris to make him act the way he did. As Chris's constant headaches only seemed to get worse. But he still refused to seek medical treatment. On February 6, 1977, the two were driving the streets of Adelaide when Chris spotted a young girl waiting at a train station and told James, pull over, I want that one. The girl was 16-year-old Sylvia Pittman, who was about to board a train to return home when Chris offered her a ride, telling her that she would be saving money by not having to buy a train ticket, and so she agreed. James drove the three to their usual spot in Truro before, quote, going for a walk and leaving Chris alone with Sylvia. When he returned half an hour later, he found Chris smoking a cigarette and Sylvia dead with a pantyhose tied tightly around her neck. The two then dumped her body behind some rocks before going home. And the very next night, they would claim their fifth victim. On February 7th, Chris went to a local post office with instructions for James to pick him up by a certain time. James was surprised upon arriving at the post office in the middle of the day to find Chris in the company of a woman, 26-year-old Vicky Howell. Again, the three got into the car. James drove them out to the regular spot near Truro before going for a walk. However, upon returning a while later, he was shocked to find that the two were still chatting and laughing and seemed to be having a good time. So, he turned around and went walking again. When he returned 20 minutes later, Vicky was dead, having been strangled with a rope, and Chris was in a blind rage, talking to himself and swearing at the sky. James attempted to calm him down, but that only seemed to make Chris focus on him more, and for a second, James thought Chris was going to kill him. But he managed to calm him down by assuring Chris they would get rid of the body and that, quote, "there's plenty of fish in the sea." So now he's encouraging it. He's like calming him down. He's like, "Don't worry, man. Like, we'll find another girl for you can kill. There's plenty of fish in the sea." And that's actually something that made Chris smile and calm down. So by this point, Chris had murdered 5 women with the help of James, and his attacks were only escalating and becoming more frequent as their next victim would be just 2 days later. On February 9th, the two picked up 16-year-old Connie Lordonades in the city center of Adelaide after offering her a lift home. This scenario was unique in that initially Chris pretended to be gay and James was his partner. Of course, most likely in an attempt to ease Connie's nerves about getting into the car with 2 strange men. Almost immediately when the two started driving, Connie became frightened upon realizing they were going the wrong way. Chris attempted to calm her, but she began to fight him and scream as she fought to get out of the car. Finally, Chris ordered James to pull over off a deserted road as he strangled Connie to death in the back seat. Following this, the two drove her body out to Truro in order to dump it along with the others. 3 days later, this is literally almost a daily occurrence. On February 12th, Chris and James were driving along West Terrace when they spotted 20-year-old Deborah Lamb hitchhiking and stopped to pick her up. As they drove, Deborah was calm and relaxed as she flirted with Chris in the back seat. James drove them to an isolated area of Port Gawler where he parked the car and went for one of his walks. James stated by the time he got back to the car, Deborah was nowhere to be found, and he found Chris off to the side of the road, pushing dirt into a shallow hole in the ground, which he assumed was where Deborah was, and he was right. But now, sadly and horrifically, it would later be discovered that Chris hadn't strangled Deborah like his previous victims, and instead she was alive when he placed her in the hole, and he buried her alive. In just a 3-month period, Chris Worrell and James Miller claimed the lives of 7 women, and they showed no signs of slowing down. Although they did take the week following Deborah's murder off, James described this period as being fairly calm and relaxed. The two's final victim would come on February 19th, 1977, and their reign of terror would come to an end, which almost 2 years before the bodies were found. That evening, the two went to visit a friend's apartment, but upon arriving were instead greeted by a young woman, 20-year-old Deborah Skuse, sitting on the floor and crying. Deborah revealed that she was the girlfriend of their friend, and he had broken up with her and left the apartment. Immediately, seizing the opportunity, Chris began to comfort her before suggesting that she could hang out with him and James for the weekend just in order to lift her spirits. Deborah agreed and went with the 2 men, but unlike the previous cases, the trio actually spent Friday night partying, bar hopping, and having a good time. Deborah and Chris flirted the entire night, and eventually the two decided to drive out to the area of Mount Gambier to spend the weekend partying. Once at the cabin they were staying in, Chris began to slip from his cheery mood into one of his dark moods, and according to James, began making statements about how he wanted to murder Deborah. But this time James did put his foot down and warned him that this could not happen, as unlike the previous victims,
people saw them together.
Multiple eyewitnesses had seen them with Deborah, and multiple people knew the 3 were partying together that weekend. And also, this is their first victim they actually had a connection to. This is the girlfriend or ex-girlfriend of one of their friends. They run around in the same friend group. So this is not a random hitchhiker. This is someone close to them. Now, this actually made Chris grow irritated as his plans had been ruined and he agreed. But now that he was angry, he told James and Deborah that the party was over and they were all just going to drive back home. With Chris behind the wheel, he began driving erratically down the twisty road, faster and faster. Both James and Deborah screamed at him to slow down, but this only caused him to grow angrier and go faster. Chris sped down the road, faster and faster, until finally the front tire popped and sent the car into a violent spin before it began to flip over and over, sending Chris, James, and Deborah flying from the car and onto the road. When James came to days later in a hospital bed, he was given the news that neither Chris nor Deborah survived the crash, and he was the sole survivor. The crash was seen as a terrible accident, and no one had any idea that a serial killer's reign of terror had abruptly come to an end. So that is divine intervention or something? I don't know. That's one of those crazy details where it's like, they murdered 7 people, gonna murder an 8th in literally 2.5 months. And it ended just because of this random act of
stupidity. Poor Deborah, though.
And poor Deborah, and that was also a point of contention for a while there where they were like, do we count Deborah as one of the victims or do we not count her as one of the victims? And 100% you count her as one of the victims because she was killed by Chris's complete stupidity. So she is his final victim. James recovered in the hospital for several weeks before checking himself out in time to attend Chris's funeral. Now, while at the funeral, James ran into a former girlfriend of Chris's named Amelia, and the two began making small talk. Amelia asked James if he had heard the results of Chris's autopsy, and that's when she revealed that a massive blood clot was discovered on his brain that had been there for a while. Now, at that moment, everything clicked for James, and he rationalized that this must have been the cause of Chris's moods and the reason he became a killer. It's like that aha moment. He was like, so there was something wrong with him. Unable to contain this revelation, James revealed to Amelia that the car crash was a blessing. Otherwise, Chris would have continued to kill girls as the blood clot was getting worse. Now, of course, Amelia's like, what the frick are you talking about?
Now, what did you say?
James did manage to keep his mouth shut and didn't elaborate on it. And Amelia just assumed at that point, he's grieving. He is still suffering the effects of a horrific crash. And there's really, at this point, also remember, these missing person cases weren't front page news. So they weren't really well known by the public. So she was just kind of like, he's just a weird dude. And I guess we all grieve differently. So she put it on the back burner of her mind for a minute.
I think if someone told me about them and somebody else murdering someone, or mentioned, man, I'm glad that happened because now the murders will stop, I think I couldn't put that on the back burner.
I couldn't either, and we see this a lot in the cases that we cover, but then I'm like, I guess not everyone is true crime junkies like we are, so their immediate first thought isn't, they're serious, I'm talking to a serial killer, but still.
I think a lot of people just don't want it to be true so bad that they'll tell themselves anything so that it's not true and so that they're not part of this.
And also it's that thing, people just don't want to get involved. They're like, if I come forward, then I'm involved. I don't want to have to deal with that. So they're like, I'm just going to ignore it.
But if you hear something and someone tells you the murders are going to stop now that happened, do something. Tell somebody because...
At least mention it.
Yeah, at least mention it because especially if they're like, the murders aren't going to stop, you could save somebody's life just by saying something. Whether it's real or not. I'm sure the cops would love to hear about it.
So following Chris's funeral, James fell into a deep depression. He was evicted from the apartment they shared together after failing to pay rent and mostly lived on the streets for the next year or so. He described feeling lost and empty and spent a lot of his free time visiting Chris's grave, and he even placed an in memoriam for Chris in the local paper a year after the death, which read, and I'll actually let you read this, Brad.
Worrell Christopher Robin, which immediately makes me think of Winnie the Pooh.
My first thought, too.
Memories of a friend who died 12 months ago this week. Your friendship, thoughtfulness, and kindness will be remembered by me. What comes after death, I can hope. I pray we meet again. If there's a hell, you're going to meet in hell.
Yeah, your friendship, thoughtfulness, and kindness will be remembered by me. It's the delusion for it. And it's I know love blinds you to a lot of things, but nothing can blind you to the fact that you aided and abetted a serial killer to torture, assault, and murder 7, 8 women.
Most of them like 15 to 16-year-old children.
Yeah, and it's literal 15, 16-year-olds, teenagers, children. All this in the span of just 2 months. So it's wild, the delusion here. Now, the Truro murders went unreported or even known for over a year until the discovery of Veronica Knight in April of 1979. Following the discovery of 3 more bodies, the police and public at large finally realized that they had a serial killer on their hands with little leads to go on. Investigators turned to the public for help, but honestly were not very hopeful. They had no suspects, no eyewitnesses, and no evidence of any kind at any of the crime scenes. But within days of the news breaking, someone made a call to investigators. Chris's former girlfriend, Amelia, came forward, stating she may actually have info relating to the murders, and that's when she told them about Chris and the things James told her at his funeral, stating she just thought James was grieving until reading about the bodies in the paper. So at least she did come forward. I give her a little credit. Thankfully, no one was murdered after she was told of it. So with that, investigators were able to track James down to a local homeless shelter and brought him in for questioning on May 23rd, 1979. Almost immediately, he stated, quote, "I should have turned myself in a long time ago before laying out the details of everything that happened." And investigators would later state that had Amelia not come forward, this case would have never been solved. So I will give her credit there. And they were like, we had nothing. And so if she did not have this lead for us, this would still remain one of Australia's most bizarre mysteries. After telling his story, James revealed to police that there were 3 more bodies and led them to the remains of Juliet Makata, Deborah Lamb, and Tanya Kinney. By sunrise, James Miller was arrested and charged with 7 counts of murder. James would go on trial in 1980, and he would plead not guilty to all charges, as his defense laid out the story of how James was brainwashed, abused, and manipulated by Chris to assist him in the murders. And of course, they also argued that James didn't actually kill any of the victims. He simply drove the car. James would state, quote, "I'm fine with them giving me life in prison for driving the car, but saying that I actually helped kill those girls is bullshit." James also answered the judge truthfully when asked what would have happened had Chris not been killed in the car crash, and he stated, "I would still be out there driving him around so he could kill girls. I would never betray Chris." Tilly, and even on his own trial where they're about to put him away for life, and they're like, what would have happened? He goes, honestly, I would still be helping him kill girls until his heart content, because I love him and I'll do whatever he wants, even if that means becoming one of the most prolific serial killers in Australian history.
Why couldn't James just meet a nice man that all he wanted him to do was maybe cook him dinner?
I was about to say, James is the definition of a ride or die bitch, I guess.
Yes. I mean,
if he had found a nice man to be that loyal to, instead he found a literal serial killer. But also, that's not trying to minimize what James did. James is also a piece of crap.
I mean, he says he didn't have anything to do with killing these girls, but he knew their fate driving them out there. And he never turned anybody in. And he even said, I would continue to do this.
So, yeah, James also lost all sympathy. In the end, James was found guilty of first-degree murder, as it was determined that he was part of a criminal enterprise, and he was sentenced to life in prison. In 1984, James wrote his own book called Don't Call Me a Killer, where he defends the stance that he is not a killer because he did not kill any of these girls. And that, for his whole life, that is his main focus. He's like, I am fine with life in prison. I deserve life in prison. But he keeps going like, but I wish people would stop calling me a killer because I didn't kill any of these girls. And it's like, I'm not sure it's clicking in your brain that you drove these girls to their death, so you are just as complicit in their murders. For years, he continuously applied for parole, all which were denied. Finally, on October 21st, 2008, James Miller passed away from liver failure caused by hepatitis C, while also having complications from both lung and liver cancer. And with that, the story of the Truro murderers would come to an end, although the story remains one of the darkest and most bizarre serial killing duos in history. And that is the story of the Truro murders. One of the more well-known cases that we've covered on this podcast. I've seen it covered a few times on like YouTube and other podcasts. Still don't think it gets enough coverage. And also I think it's just one of the most unique serial killing cases I've heard, because you have a serial killer and you have this gay man who hangs around him who's so obsessed with him.
He's an enabler.
He's so obsessed with him that he's like, I love this man, so if he asks me to drive him around to help pick up victims, take him out somewhere to help get rid of the body, I will do it unapologetically.
Even though he'll never love me.
Even though he will never love me, he honestly treats me like crap.
We'll never be in a relationship.
And it's just such a fascinating dichotomy where it's like, and he's aware of this. James Miller is fully aware. He's like, I'm fully aware Chris is a straight man. I'll never be with him. But at the same time, I love him so much that I can't even think about not having him in my life in some capacity. So even if that means he only keeps me around because I'm useful in helping him pick up victims and get rid of the bodies, he's like, so be it. It's a very interesting, very tragic, very sad case. So horrific that all these women had to die because James Miller had a crush on a serial killer. And with that, thank you guys again so much for tuning in for another episode. If you enjoyed this episode or the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot, helps other people discover the podcast. And of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from today's case, you can follow us on Instagram at Beers with Queers Pod, that's POD, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until next week, all y'all have an amazing Thanksgiving, eat lots of food, enjoy each other's company, and stay dangerous out there.
See you soon.